So now that we've looked at the four tissue types and their functions and their locations, let's talk about the way tissues are organized into organs and membranes. So, what is an organ? We know that an organ is made up of two or more tissue types and they're going to work together. Now we've covered the four tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. And as an example here, we're looking at the stomach, which is an organ, and we're looking at the different tissues that make up the stomach organ itself. So we see that at the surface or in the lumen of the stomach, we have epithelial tissue, the simple columnar epithelial. We have areolar connective tissue. Then we have dense irregular connective tissue. Notice the presence of vascular tissue and nerves. And then we're going to have the presence of smooth muscle, additional connective tissue, and finally, simple squamous epithelium. So we're going to spend a little time talking about some of the serous membranes that are formed from tissues. All right, so what are our body membranes? Body membranes can be, three of them are made of an epithelial layer connected to or bound to connective tissue. We have one type, the synovial, that actually is just a connective tissue membrane. But where do we find these body membranes? Well, they're going to line cavities, they're going to line joint surfaces, they cover our viscera or our organs, and they cover our body's external surface. So the four types are the cutaneous, the serous, the mucous, and the synovial. So let's start with our mucous membrane or our mucosa. This is going to line passages of our body that are open to the external environment. So that would be our digestive tract, our respiratory system. Those are both open to the external environment, our urinary tract, and our reproductive system. These are called mucous membranes because they get coated with secretions that are produced from exocrine glands that are present in this tissue. In the mucosa, the connective tissue has a special name called the lamina propria. So you can see from the figure at the right, if the lumen of the organ, and then below that, or the layer that's at the lumen, would be the epithelium. Notice that there's a mucus layer that's secreted by those exocrine glands, and then below or connected to the epithelium is the lamina propria, or that connective tissue layer. All right, another membrane, which is actually our largest body membrane, is the cutaneous membrane. So we might also call this our skin. The outer layer or the surface is called the epidermis. And when we looked at our different types of tissue, remember that we said this epidermis is made up of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. And remember that outer part, the keratinized dead cells there are sloughed off, right, at the surface of the skin. Now, below the epidermis or deep to the epidermis is the dermis, and this layer is made of connective tissue. Now, in the next lesson, we actually have a whole lesson on the integumentary system or our skin. So we'll learn more about what we find in the epidermis, what we find in the dermis. We'll go into detail about that. But generally, what is the purpose of this membrane? Well, protection, right? And then preventing water loss from our bodies. All right, we already covered serous membranes in lesson 1. And we know that these are important for lining some body cavities that don't open to the external environment. We know they cover organs. What we probably didn't mention specifically in lesson 1 is that these are made of two layers. They have an epithelial layer and they have a connective tissue layer. The epithelium is called the mesothelium. So it's an epithelial tissue, but in these serous membranes, it has a special name called mesothelium. So we do already know from lesson 1 that these membranes produce a fluid to prevent friction, right? And this is called serous fluid. Now, we also know from lesson 1 that we have a visceral layer, which is the layer that's going to be against the organ or the viscera. And then we have a parietal layer, which is typically against the body wall. So you see at the top, the figure shows you that we have the serous fluid between the epithelium, and then below or deep to the epithelium is the connective tissue layer. We see that the visceral layer then is going to be next to the organ, whereas the parietal layer is going to be usually next to the body wall. Now, that's showing a little cross-section, right, of what those tissue layers would look like. But I wanted to bring back the figure that we looked at in lesson 1 to remember that what this is doing is we have a cavity, right, that's filled with that space or that serous fluid. And so the membrane that's against, so in this case, we would call this the pericardium, right, because this is the heart we're looking at. So the membrane that's closest to the heart is the visceral pericardium. And then we have a cavity, right, the pericardial cavity. And then we have the outer part that is the parietal pericardium. And remember, it's as if it's one continuous layer that you put your fist in, right? And so you have the part that's around your fist, which would be around the heart, and then the part that's on the outside, or it would be next to the body wall, would be the parietal. So I've already mentioned one, right? The pericardium. Do you remember the names of the other serous membranes that we covered in lesson 1? So pause your video, see if you can recall, and then click play. So the pleura, right, which are those that surround your lungs, the pericardium, which we've mentioned, and the peritoneum, which is in the abdominal cavity. Now, synovial membranes are those that are made of connective tissue. They don't have the epithelium component. These are found in some joints, these freely movable joints, or joints that have movement. We'll have a whole lesson when we talk about joints, and some of the joints will be synovial, so we'll talk more specifically about how these membranes work in these joints. But essentially, their job is to produce synovial fluid. We don't want friction between bones in our joints, so it's going to prevent that from happening.